1 Corinthians chapter 1. I said chapter 4. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul started dealing about halfway through the chapter, started dealing with cliques in the church. That's a big problem, cliques in the church. Now, there are cliques everywhere that you go. Obviously, probably a lot of you, most of you maybe everybody has started back to school. You got cliques there. It's just what happens. It's how it is. Maybe if you've had a job, maybe if you worked this summer, maybe you're still working. You know that there are cliques in the workplace. If you're on a team, volleyball, soccer, football, baseball, whatever kind of team, any kind of sport, you know that there are cliques even within the team. There are just cliques everywhere. That's how the world operates, but the difference is, or the issue that we have is that shouldn't be happening in the church, and yet we know that it does. And the reason that it does is because all of us are a bunch of imperfect people, and you get hooked up with your crew, and you're comfortable with them, and you have a good time hanging out with them, which is fine. It's absolutely okay. But the problem comes when we won't let anybody else into that group. When it's, we let them know. However we do that, no, you can't. You don't even go here. We don't want you. Don't even join up with us because we've got our little group and we don't want anybody to mess it up. Well, Paul's been dealing with that problem because it was a problem in the church in Corinth. They were actually. It's funny. They were actually picking their favorite leaders, their favorite church leaders or Bible teachers. They didn't have a lot else to do, I guess, back then. They didn't have celebrities and whoever else. But what they had was these Bible teachers, and they were actually choosing their favorite Bible teachers, and then they were hating on each other because of it. And there were some, we were told way back in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, some were saying, well, we're of Paul. We follow Paul the apostle. Others were saying, well, we follow Apollos, another one of the teachers that came after Paul. Some were saying, we follow Cephas. That was Peter. You ever heard of Peter? His name was also Cephas. And then some were saying, well, we're not of any of those guys. We're of Jesus. And they had their favorite Bible teachers, which also is not a problem. The problem came when they had their favorites, their favorite leaders, and they started to divide over that. They started to hate on each other over those things. So Paul started in chapter 1, continued on to chapter 2, continued on in chapter 3, and then finally into chapter 4. So we've got some main divisions here in this chapter, if you're taking notes. 3 main divisions, servants and stewards. So he's going to show us, he's going to tell us once again that these Bible teachers, these Paul, Apollos, Cephas, these guys, they're just servants and stewards. We'll talk about that. And then he's going to talk about being a spectacle, being in the spotlight. And then thirdly, spiritual sons and daughters of Paul. So we'll talk about all of those. Well, let's pick it up in verse 1 in our first section, which is servants and stewards. He says, verse 1, let a man so consider us as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. Let a man, so he's saying to the Corinthians, all of you should be viewing Paul the Apostle, Apollos, whoever your favorite leaders are, you should be viewing us simply as servants and stewards. Okay? Not stewards like Lisa Stewart or John Stewart, but a steward. We'll talk about what that is in just a moment, but first we'll deal with servants. We're all familiar with this word servants, or many of us are. We understand what a servant is. He actually uses a different word here for servant. Let a man so consider us as servants of Christ. This time when he uses the word servant, it is the word, the original word is under rower. Anybody know what an under rower is? Anybody? Not underwear, under rower. You know what an under rower is? Okay. An under rower, you had ships at the time where you would have levels of men down below rowing the boat. They'd have a huge oar. You probably have seen movies or whatever where they would stick the oars out of these ships and they would row. Well, when he calls himself, when he says, listen, we're just servants of Christ, he says we're actually just under rowers. We're not even like the top rowers, we're the under rowers. Now, it seems like, well, what's the big deal with that? Or why, what Paul is doing is he's showing the Corinthians, look, we're nothing special. God blessed us with the ability to teach or to share the gospel. But if it weren't for God, we wouldn't be able to do that. So he's saying, look, we're just servants, we're just under rowers. And when he pictures himself as an under rower, he's saying, look, there's rows of rowers on this ship, so to speak. He says, and we're not the top ones. We're under rowers. We're somewhere underneath. Now, this is not a glorious picture at all. A lot of times people go, oh man, the pastor, the speaker, man, look at, he's got the lights or the camera or the stage, and oh, he's so, and we can fix the speakers up and, put lights and stuff, and, so you get kind of distracted, you don't realize what dorks they are. An under rower would sit underneath the other rowers who are rowing the boats, okay? Now, among other things like dark, wet, those types of things, what do you do if you're an under rower and you got to go to the bathroom? What do you do if you're down there rowing a boat and you got to go to the bathroom? You can't just jump up and go, oh, you know what, I'm done rowing, I'm going to go, I got to go to the bathroom real quick. Where's the bathroom on a boat anyways? An under rower would sit underneath other rowers above him, and those rowers, when they needed to go to the bathroom, would just go. They weren't allowed to just get up and walk away. They had to continue rowing. Now, we're all familiar with gravity, correct? Yes? Yes. Gravity means that things go up or down? Down. So if I'm an under rower and I've got rowers above me, and those guys above me have to go to the bathroom, guess what happens? That's just one of the nasty things that goes along with an under rower. And when Paul he's trying to get the Corinthians to understand, listen, I'm nothing special other than God blessing me. That's all I've got. He says, I'm an under rower. And immediately all of these people in the Corinthian church, all of the Corinthians, would know exactly what he was talking about. They would have that picture of somebody that's at the bottom of the boat rowing, and then they would immediately think about people above them that have to go to the bathroom or whatever, and what a nasty job that would be. And Paul is saying that's all we are. Now, it gets better, slightly better than that. He begins by saying, listen, I'm an under rower, this is what happens to me. But then he goes on in verse 1 to say we're servants of Christ and stewards of the mystery of God. And a steward is someone, what he's saying is we don't own the mysteries of God. They're not like ours. It's not the mysteries of Paul. They're God's mysteries. And we've been given stewardship over those things. In other words, they're God's. He gave them to us to share with everybody. And we're taking care of them. The reason he's telling them that is because he wants them, again, to understand that, listen, Paul didn't come into Corinth with his own great message about how great he was. He came into Corinth with a message of how great God is. So he's just taking care of that. He's a steward. Okay? Some of you have flown in planes, right? How many of you hate to fly? Anybody hate to fly? Yeah? Okay. I don't hate it, but it's just kind of like, I do it when I have to, but it's kind of like, I'm not real excited about it, It's not really the flying part. It's the thought of being thousands of feet in the air, all the engines blow up at the same time, and we just dive bomb and die. And it's not even the hitting the ground part, because I'm pretty sure that once you hit the ground, you probably don't feel anything. It's the dropping. That's what scares me to death. But you've been on a plane, you got a steward or a stewardess. What do? They bring you crackers. Right? They bring you 7-Ups or whatever, bring you whatever they're bringing you, a headset so you can watch a movie or whatever. So that's what Paul is saying. Listen, we're just under rowers and stewards. So don't put us up on some pedestal where, we're like some celebrity. Paul says we're not. Now he says in verse 2, he's going to tell us 3 things about these servants and stewards, about the stewards specifically. Verse 2. Moreover, it is required in stewards that one be found faithful. So when it comes to servants and stewards, those individuals need to be faithful. They need to start a job. They need to do well. They need to finish it well. That's what a servant or a steward does. If you had someone like, let's say you're on a plane, again, and you have a steward or a stewardess, and you say, hey, could I get some crackers? Or those little biscuits, those little cookies, what are they called? I don't remember what they're called, but, can I get some of those little cookies and maybe a 7-Up? And, maybe they show up with a magazine and a cup of coffee. And you're like, hey, this is not what I wanted. You no longer want them, right? You want a different steward or stewardess. You want someone else to tend to your needs. Paul is saying, listen, a steward, as far as God's kingdom is concerned, as far as servants are concerned, a steward, somebody who's taking care, has to do a good job, a faithful job. Now, he's talking about himself in verses 3 and 4. So he starts with faithfulness, and then he says he's free from earthly judgment. Look at this. Keep in mind that he's talking about himself being a servant, being a steward. It says in verse 3, but with me, it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by a human court. In fact, I do not even judge myself. Verse 4, for I know of nothing against myself, yet I am not justified by this, but he who judges me is the Lord. And we'll look at the Lord's judgment in just a moment. But essentially what he's saying in verses 3 and 4 is he's a steward. He's doing his best to be faithful. And then he says in verses 3 and 4, he says, but if you Corinthians think I'm faithful or you think I'm unfaithful, basically what he says in verse 3 is, it really doesn't matter to me. Verse 4, for I know of nothing against myself. He says, I don't even judge myself. No self-condemnation. He says, yet I am not justified by this, but he who judges me is the Lord. So we'll get into that in just a moment when we get into verse 5. But what he's saying is this, is that as a servant of God, his main goal is to please God. It's to please God. Paul didn't go to Corinth to be popular. He didn't go to Corinth to make a lot of friends. He didn't go to Corinth to get his yearbook signed by the most people that year. He was not concerned with those things. What he was concerned with was whether God was pleased with him or not. And so it helps you and I to understand that when we serve God, that we're not doing it to please other people. I really, really, really like you guys. I didn't say love. Just kidding. I love you guys. I love, but sometimes you can love people but not really like them, you know what I mean? I love you guys and I like you. Okay? Let me look around quick. I like, well, most of you, never mind. Just kidding. I like all of you. Okay? Love you and I like you. However, my main goal in coming in here is not to get you to like me. My goal in here is to love you, share God's word with you, so that God can use his word to speak to your life and speak to your heart. And then if you like me, on top of that, bonus points. Okay? I've been involved in, I say this a lot, I've been involved in ministry, youth ministry and ministry a long time. Sometimes people don't like me. There's only so much I can do about it. You know how sometimes people just don't like you? You don't know why, they just don't like you. And you're like, man, I'm so lovable, I don't know why they don't like me. I've been involved in ministry a long time, and sometimes people just don't like me. Maybe because of something I said or something I did or what, I don't know. The way I look, I don't know. But I can't dwell on that. My main goal is that God is pleased. When I leave here on Wednesday night, I'm praying and asking God, was that satisfactory to you? Was that what you wanted? That's my main goal. And that's what Paul is saying here. He says, you Corinthians, he says, I'm not worried about if you're judging me. At the end of verse 3, I don't even judge myself. His judgment is coming from the Lord. So he's free from earthly judgment. That helps you and I when we're serving the Lord to understand that we don't have to be worried about what other people say. I'm serving God. You can like it or not like it. I'm trying to please God. Now, there is judgment, and he talks about that in verses 5 and 6 when he talks about this future judgment. Therefore, he tells the Corinthians, judge nothing before the time, until the Lord comes, who will both bring to light the hidden things of darkness, that's what God's going to do, and reveal the counsels of the hearts. In other words, the hidden things of the hearts. Then each one's praise will come from God. Now, this is a key verse, verse 6. Now, these things, brothers or family, I have figuratively transferred to myself and Apollos for your sakes. I'm going to explain this in just a moment. That you may learn in us, here it is, that you may learn in us not to think beyond what is written, that none of you may be puffed up on behalf of one against the other. Context. I told you at the beginning that Paul was talking about cliques still. He's still talking about cliques. And what does all this have to do with cliques? Well, I'll explain to you. What was happening in the Corinthian church is you had a group that was picking their favorite, Paul. You had another group that was picking their favorite, Apollos. And the people that loved Paul the best and the people that loved Apollos the best were both Christians, but they were hating on one another. And Paul is still talking about that same topic and that same subject. And when he talked about the judgment, he says, listen, those of you that love Apollos, don't look at me, Paul, and judge me. Let God do that. God's going to do that. And he says to the Corinthians, those of you that love me, Paul, and you don't love Apollos, don't judge Apollos. Let God do that. He had told us in the previous chapter last week, all things are yours. Paul is yours. Apollos is yours. It's all yours. We talked about what that looks like here at Revival, at Fusion. What does that look like? We have a lot of people in here who love Chris Plaza. I love the guy. It's not this Chris versus that Chris. Hairy Chris versus bald Chris. Old Chris versus young Chris. They're both yours. They're all yours. The leaders that we have in here, the leaders that they have in junior high, it's not two different teams. It's one team. It's two different rooms, two different groups of students, but it's all yours. You have access to all of it. You can ask Josie to pray for you. Or you could go over and hit up Carlos in the junior high room and say, could you pray for me? You have your choice. It's not one against the other. So Paul, you see what was going on in Corinth was basically like, there was like, just to kind of put it in perspective, there was one group saying, no, we love Chris Plaza. No, we love Chris Amaro. And they were against each other. And Paul says there's no need for that. Don't judge one or the other. Okay? They're both from God and all things are yours. So in verse 5, he says, listen, God's going to give the ultimate judgment. He'll decide. And in verse 5, at the end of verse 5, each one's praise will come from God. So don't glorify one person above another. God will take care of all of that. And in verse 6, he gives us the key here, what he's talking about. Now, these things, brothers or family, ladies, gentlemen, brothers, sisters, I have figuratively transferred to myself. In other words, the things that I've been talking about really are meant to help you understand Paul and Apollos, for your sakes, that you may learn in us not to think beyond what is written. Don't think too highly of us, is what he's saying. That none of you may be puffed up on behalf of one against the other. Now he moves into the second section here, which we will do, which is the spectacle in verses 7 through 13. He says, for who makes you differ from one or from another? And what do you have that you did not receive? Let me help you understand what these questions that he's asking. For who makes you differ from another? There's no difference. We're all believers. The believers, the Christians that are in here, are just older versions of the Christians that are over in the junior high room. But we're all believers. So we can't look down on them like, oh, the junior hires, little kids or whatever, we might think. No, we're believers, it's just different ages. And then he asks the question, and what do you have that you did not receive? In other words, the question he's asking is this. He's asking the Corinthians, what do you have? Spiritually speaking, what do you have that you earned on your own? The answer was nothing. They had nothing. Everything they had was from God. He says in verse 7, now, if you indeed receive it, if you received it from God, you didn't earn it, you received it. Why do you boast as if you had not received it? He says, why are you bragging about it like if you earned it yourself, the spiritual blessings that you have? Verse 8, you are already full. It's the same thing he said in the previous chapter. You've got everything. You are already rich. You have reigned as kings without us. And indeed, I could wish you did reign, that we also might reign with you. He says, man, you're experiencing all of God's blessings already. You don't need to fight over these things. They're silly things. Now, the spectacle part. What is a spectacle? A spectacle would be like your favorite celebrity. Your favorite celebrity would be a spectacle. A singer, musician, an actor or actress, whatever your favorite celebrity, maybe an athlete, okay? They would be a spectacle. They've got the center stage. They're in the spotlight, okay? And he says, listen, we've been made a spectacle. We've been put in the spotlight. And he's going to explain, look at verse 9. He says, for I think that God has displayed us, the apostles, last as men condemned to death, for we have been made a spectacle to the world, both to angels and to men. So he says, we've been put, these spiritual leaders that they had, Paul and the others, had been put like in the spotlight. Now, not in a good way. Let me think. Guess there hasn't been one in a long time. I was just, the other day I was watching a documentary, because that's what old people do. They watch documentaries. And it was a documentary on O.J. Simpson. Anybody know who that is? O.J. Simpson? Okay. Remember him and the whole glove thing and all that? I was watching a documentary on him and that whole murder accusation against him. Well, I can remember I was working in a garage, like a automotive garage, changing tires and doing different things. And I remember the last day of that trial when the judgment was going to come down. And I mean, the whole shop stopped, all the mechanics, everybody stopped. And we were huddled around Tom's radio. Tom was one of the mechanics there. And he had a radio in there where he would play his oldies or whatever. And the judgment, here they go, they're about to give their judgment. The jury's coming back out. So the whole shop stopped, everything stopped. The shop stopped, the world stopped basically. And we all gathered around his radio in the shop and everybody's listening. The salesmen from inside, they all came out and everybody's listening. But we would go home, this is how boring we were back in the olden days, in the 1900s. We would go home, catch up on the news at night. What? OJ, oh man, this is what happened. Oh, and they said this and they did that. Oh, he had this glove and it wouldn't fit. Oh man, no, he's innocent. No, he's guilty. No, he's innocent. And it was just this, he was a spectacle. He was in the spotlight. Not in a good way, but he was a spectacle. And Paul says, listen, he says, you guys are elevating us, these church leaders. He says, you guys are elevating us like we're some kind of celebrities. He said, we've been made a spectacle. And he describes several of the things from verses 9 to 13. These things will blow your mind. Verse 9. For I think that God has displayed, put us on display, the apostles, last, not first, last. He says, as men condemned to death. Verse 10, he says, we are fools for Christ's sake. And then using some, being sarcastic, he tells them, but you are wise in Christ. We are weak, but you are strong. You are distinguished, but we are dishonored. What he's doing is he's using some sarcasm with these Corinthians, trying to get them to understand that they're nothing special either. That anything good about them is because of God. So when he says, we are fools for Christ's sake, but you are wise in Christ, he's trying to get them to realize, oh, you guys are the apostles. If you're fools, then we're fools. He says in verse 10, we are fools for Christ's sake, but you are wise in Christ. We are weak, but you are strong. You are distinguished, but we are dishonored. Verse 11, to the present hour, he says, as he's writing from Ephesus to the Corinthians, to the present hour, we both hunger and thirst. You hear what he said? He says, we don't have quite enough food, we don't have quite enough drink. We are poorly clothed, beaten, and homeless. Talking about himself, talking about the other Bible teachers. It was not a glamorous job to be a Bible teacher or a preacher in those times. We all have seen what's going on in Afghanistan, yes or no? Yes? Sad things, scary things, some terrible things. I've heard reports of believers and even other people being beheaded already. I don't know how true it is or not, but I'm hearing all these reports. We know that it's happened in the past. To be a Christian in Afghanistan right now is not like, hey, let's all gather Wednesday night at the church and turn on the air conditioning and we'll get some worship music going and we'll get the electric guitars going and get some lights and let's rock out, man, and let's just have a good time. It's not like, hey, let's have a great time right now. It's not right now. To be a Christian in Afghanistan is really a matter of life and death. Taliban's coming through. They're looking for people. They're looking for Christians to kill. Not to ask them Bible questions. Well, what do you think about Genesis chapter 3? Verse. You're a Christian. They want them dead. Paul, and the things that he describes here, could be seen in that same way. For Paul, there were people that were out to kill him. We read about it in the book of Acts, those of you that were here. They took him outside the city and stoned him and left him for dead. And the guy got back up, wobbly, dizzy, and he walked back into the city. I would have walked right back to an Uber and left. But the guy he goes back in. He says in verse 12, he says, we labor, working with our own hands. They weren't paid. Didn't have benefits. Didn't have 401k. Didn't get a pastor mobile. He says we we labor, working with our own hands. Being reviled, we bless. In other words, people speaking out curses against them, we bless. Being persecuted, we endure. Verse 13, being defamed, we entreat. We have been made as the filth of the world, Paul says. The offscouring of all things until now. I got to tell you something. I'm a pastor. I've got an official document that was signed by some guys that you don't even know and given to me that says I'm a pastor. That means that I can officially perform weddings now. I don't know. It's probably about the biggest change. I don't know. I'm a pastor, and I got to tell you something. My life as a pastor has never been this hard. Never. Never. I get vacation time. And I got to tell you, I feel slightly ashamed. I get over it real quickly because I like my vacation time. But Paul didn't have vacation time. He didn't have some home church that was putting money into his 401k, so that when he hit 60 or 65, he could retire. Paul was going to die almost in a Roman prison. They would take him out only to execute him later on in his life. That's what it meant to be a pastor at that time. And Paul is looking at the Corinthians like, wait, you guys are putting us up on this pedestal like we're something special and treating us like we're celebrities, and I'm choosing this person, you choose that. He goes, you got to knock that off. He says, listen, being a pastor is dangerous, and this is what we're experiencing. And in verse 13, I mean, he's just going, piling it on. And then in verse 13, he finishes by saying, we have been made as the filth of the world, the offscouring of all things until now. Who went with us to summer camp? This past summer camp, raise your hand. Okay. Remember meal times? When we were done with the meals, what did we do with our dishes? Does anybody remember? What did we do?
We gave it to people for them to wash it.
Okay. Before we handed it to them, what do we do right in between there?
Like bins, put it in these bins.
Put it in the bins. The offscouring. Paul says, we have been made as the filth of the world, the offscouring of all things until now. You know, when you go to wash your dishes at home, put it in the dishwasher, you rinse it off, and then you put it in the dishwasher? That's the offscouring. All that stuff that your mom's lasagna that you didn't eat, put it down the drain real quick, and zzz, the offscouring. Paul says that's who we are. We're the offscouring. Is it okay to love your favorite Bible teacher or your favorite church leader, is it okay to have a favorite pastor? Yeah, it is. That's okay. But you must understand that those individuals are not on some pedestal above everybody else. You must understand that they are normal individuals. Church leaders are normal men and women who struggle, who sin, who are trying to follow hard after Jesus just like you are. Now, we need to run through these last verses real quickly. No, we don't. I'm not, you know what? Oh, it's going to kill me. Spectacle. Mistreatment was the only thing I had there, and we're going to stop there.